everything is racist.
And yes, we mean that. Everything is racist.
You either don't care, don't know.
Or don't want to give up the privileges racism gives you.
Brought to you by two cousins.
Tired of the world's tomfoolery.
My name's Jocelyn.
And I'm Bettina. So, this is our second episode, and now that we've established that everything is racist, it's in the first one, and that we can find it everywhere, we are going to more specific topics this time. So, a lot has happened this last month. We're recording this in November, right after the election. And just for the sake of time, we're just going to get right into the main topic.
So this topic is going to be voting in the elections. We actually just had our presidential election. It was on November 3rd for the United States. And now we have a new president-elect as of November 7th, Joe Biden. Thank goodness.
Right.
It was a doozy of an election period, very suspenseful and very long.
This is the longest election season I have ever experienced in my life.
Pins and needles the entire time. Anxiety was on 10. News coverage was
It was
constant
gold. It was gold,
as
though.
well. It was absolute gold. And I think that both of us agree that we're not necessarily big fans of Biden, but we are ecstatic that Trump lost.
Mm-hmm. Completely.
And although there are a myriad of subtopics under the history of voting, we're just going to give a brief overview of the history and some things that significantly impact voters now and how corrupt, our election process is. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm just going to give a very brief outline of voting rights throughout American history. And you'll actually be able to get the link to this timeline that I'm looking at. It'll be in the description. But going back to 1776 through 1789, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution basically left it up to states to decide who does and who doesn't get to vote. Going many years later, all the way up to 1870. That's when the 15th Amendment was ratified, and Black men finally gained the right to vote throughout the United States. So, between those time periods, basically each state was going back and forth over whether people of color could vote, whether white women could vote. It was not very consistent. I feel like the only thing that was consistent was giving more and more white men the right to vote. So they took away like property value, needing to have a certain amount of money or property to your name to be able to vote. Men of various religions were able to vote. So you saw people of color basically shifting in their ability or non ability to vote, whereas white men consistently got more and more rights, basically. Jumping ahead again to 1920, which was another big year in voting history. That was when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And now it was illegal to restrict voting based on sex. And so mainly white women gained the right to vote. That was the big celebration for that. So in the 1920s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you saw a lot of Jim Crow laws and people of color trying to gain either the right to vote or the right to vote safely. The next big change in voter laws was the 23rd Amendment, and that's when the United States changed the Constitution and the residents of Washington, D.C. were able to vote. The 24th Amendment was ratified in 1964, and that made sure that states couldn't require citizens to pay a tax to vote. Jumping ahead to the 70s and 80s, you saw more rights for people who were younger. At first, the voting age was 21, and it was dropped down to 18, which is really big because men were being forced to join the army or the military, and they were getting drafted at 18, but they weren't even allowed to vote. So that was a very big change for that. Also in the 70s, the Voting Rights Act expanded to cover people who did not speak English but were US citizens, giving them the right to vote. In the 80s, expanding voting rights for people with disabilities. So, fast forwarding to the 21st century, one of the biggest things that we see is states finally allowing automatic voter registration. So, at places like the DMV, you're getting your license and things like that. You're automatically registered to vote there if you're eligible. And I think, especially given how big this election season was and seeing so many new people registering to vote for the first time or just coming out to vote and they hadn't voted in years, having things like automatic voter registration, absentee ballots, early voting was huge considering the pandemic and having to be safe. And since I've moved to Virginia, it's always been super easy to register to vote. I did it when I was at my old place and when I got to my new place, and it's all been either at the DMV or online, and so it was super convenient.
Well, it's great to hear that registration was pretty simple for you, especially in Virginia. I know a lot of people have had some trouble with registration or like finding the correct way to register. And we're going to get a lot more into that in a little bit, but I do want to recap that the timeline that Jocelyn was talking about, we will link it in the description or the show notes. So if you want to do a deeper dive and kind of understand the important points in history where certain people got the right to vote, you can take a much better extensive look at that on your own time. There's a lot of information right there. So backtracking a little bit, so why do we even vote? I think it's important to really take a look back and understand the reasons for voting, because it's tied to what this country is meant to be theoretically. Theoretically, technically, the US is a representative democracy. Representative democracy. The people who we elect in power should be representing us. But like as Jocelyn outlined, there were a lot of points in history where people in this country were not considered citizens. And so they did not have the right to vote. So, again, recapping some of those important dates, 1870 and the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. However, at this point, Native Americans and Asian Americans were not considered citizens. So that's a large portion or a significant portion of the population who could not vote during that time. And then, even with the 19th Amendment, when women, white women mostly, and technically Black women, but because of Jim Crow laws, made it very difficult for them to actually vote. It did not give Native American women or Asian American women the right to vote because at that point they still were not considered citizens. It wasn't until 1970. So I want to say that was 30 years ago, but it's not. I keep forgetting that in 2020. But n- basically, like 2 generations or 3 generations, not even ago, did um, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and other Latinx people had the right to vote. So it's a really big part of history where our democracy was not very representative. It was just in theory.
Exactly. And even just not allowing 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, but you're expecting them to serve this country by force. it's it just shows you how the government sort of wants to control us, but not give us the right to pick who's going to be in our government. There's just so many things to unpack.
Hmm. And speaking of that, so we're going to go into the very, very messy topic that is the Electoral College. What is it? No one's really sure. I mean, I can give you the definition. This is from the National Congress of State Legislatures or Legislators. The Electoral College is a unique method for indirectly electing the President of the United States. It was established in the Constitution and modified in the 12th and 23rd Amendment. Um, it consists of 538 members, one for each U.S. Senator and Representative, and three additional electors representing the District of Columbia. Each state has a number of electoral votes equal to the combined total of its congressional delegation, and each state legislature is free to determine the method it will use to select its electors. So, a very super vague group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to go into all the jargon and policy talk. All you really have to know is that it's a very bigoted system, and again, shrouded with a lot of mystery. And they did that on purpose to keep people out of power, basically. So, again, we're gonna like throw some other resources for you to actually do a better, deeper dive. We're not experts on this topic. We did our own research, but there's a lot more useful resources that you can actually go to learn more information. One of which I will highlight is the New York Times The Daily podcast recently published a podcast that pretty much sums up the very classist reasons for the founding of the Electoral College. To sum it up, the founding fathers didn't trust the common folk with selecting the best candidates for president. And so they established this body of electors that the state legislatures would pick because they feel like, as the leaders of the country, they know what's best. And it was a very like paternal, misogynistic view of things,
Mm-hmm.
racist, classist, all of that. So, of course, at that time, the electors that people would pick, or the state legislators would pick, were wealthy, white, land owning men. So, I'm sure you're going to be like, oh, well, okay, but that was the 17 and 1800s. But as we established in the first episode, a lot of these founding principles that America started on, you can still feel a lot of those echoes of like OG racism um, to this very day. And a lot of the electors, I don't know who they are, but I guarantee that they're still pretty much mostly white, wealthy, landowning men. Another resource that we want to point out is if you want like a very simple explanation of it is College Humor and Adam Ruins Everything. So we'll put a link to that in the description again. Just yeah, it's kind of disgusting, honestly.
Yeah.
And so again, to summarize everything, the Electoral College really doesn't uphold this idea of representative democracy. States, especially who have smaller populations than swing states, as we saw in this election, have way, way, way too much impact on the outcome of the election. And I am speaking and talking to you, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and North Carolina. Also, has anybody checked on Nevada? Because at this point, I don't think they're done counting.
They probably are still counting, which is sad.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the pins and needles were that because those states were taking their sweet ass time counting. And also, Republicans did not make it easy for them to count mail in ballots before election day. So,
Mhm.
of course, it was systematic.
Oh yeah, that race to 270 was like watching paint dry, like watching two turtles do a race around the world. Like it was just agonizing.
Yeah. But also, like, your life depended on it.
Yes.
So you couldn't exactly look away. But it wasn't, yeah. I mean, that sort of thing is like it's just unfair, right? That all the power goes to these states and all the power goes to the electors in these states. And even more so, there's been multiple times in history where the elected president actually lost the popular vote. And it wasn't just 2016. I know people are still trying to wrap their minds around what happened then. Like, it's happened before. It happened in 1824, it happened in 1876, it happened in 1888, and it also happened in 2000. So, you know, it's not a new phenomenon. And also the fact is, technically in almost half the states, electors could really end up choosing whoever they want for president. They don't have to go with the popular vote from the citizens of the state. If state X decided that they were going to vote for Biden, but then the elector was like, I'm going to vote for Trump, they technically could do that. So, again, who really holds the power here?
Exactly. And I don't know how the electoral college was explained to you, either in like middle or high school. My first memory of the electoral college was probably high school. I took government civics my ninth grade year, and I remember my teacher explaining it like as a way for the government to be responsible. So they were like, let's say the common people decide that they want Britney Spears to be president, which I think she would do a great job, especially in comparison to
I mean,
the
honestly.
current president. Um, but let's say like Britney Spears is elected president based on the popular vote. The electoral college's job is to be the face of reason and say, even though they chose Britney Spears, maybe she should not be president because she does not have the credentials. And so it was taught to us as if it was like a safeguard rather than something that's more sinister, which is like what it really is, like taking away the power. And I'm like, well, if we're not going to let Britney Spears be president, then why does Donald Trump get to be president? And so, like, I wish I could have told 14-year-old me that one day, like, some guy who owns a bunch of hotels and is a TV show host is going to be president, but they wouldn't let Britney Spears be president. Like, it would have thrown my teacher's whole explanation of what the Electoral College is out the window.
I mean, that's just indoctrination and education. So we can get to that in a different episode.
And honestly, he was overall a good teacher. The curriculum is
Yeah.
the issue, which again, another episode.
So let's jump into the next topic, which is voter suppression.
Yes, so this has a lot of different things to talk about as well. Again, I'm going to try to limit it, and there's going to be more resources, more resources for you if you want to do more research or read about it. And I feel like voter suppression is one of those terms that has become more recently popular over the years. It's definitely not brand new, but it's absolutely one of those buzzwords around, especially the 2016 and 2020 US elections. So I'm going to go over a few different ways that people's votes could be suppressed and then just give a definition. So, voter suppression is basically a strategy used to influence the outcome of an election by discouraging or preventing specific groups of people from voting. And I want to establish that it's very different from political campaigning. Campaigning is more of attempting to get people to want to vote for you, even going so far as to help them to register to vote, to understand what's on the ballot, to explain why it's important. Voter suppression is doing the exact opposite. And its overall intention is to reduce the number of voters so that people who could potentially be voting against your candidate or your overall interests, making sure that basically they don't vote at all. And you can see it throughout history, especially in America. A lot of the earlier ones were actually more dangerous, threatening people's lives, their livelihood, their homes. Basically, they really did not want people of color to vote because they could have a big impact on elections, especially in certain areas. But there's even some more specific ones. And I feel like the first one that comes to mind when I think on voter suppression, like when I was younger, what I was learning about is felons. And their overall right to vote. So looking back again on our timeline, um, there are several places where it talks about felons not having the right to vote. And again, it varies from state to state. Sometimes felons don't have the right to vote while they're in prison, but then when they're out, they're able to. For many, though, usually once you are a convicted felon, you lose your right to vote entirely. And this is one of those things where not it's not necessarily directly related to racism, but if you know anything about police brutality or our criminal justice system, unfortunately, a lot of black and brown people are put into prison and charged with federal crimes, regardless of whether they've done it or not. And if you have a good chunk of people who are felons that are black and brown, and you're choosing not to let them have the right to vote, it seems like a very direct connection. They're like, oh, you're trying to suppress the votes of black and brown US citizens. The next one is the closing of polling locations. And there was actually a pretty funny skit on Saturday Night Live the weekend before the election. This is when John Mulaney was hosting, who I love. He's great. And it was basically a skit where they were singing a song about strolling to the polls. And it was like a very 1970s, like disco ish type of song. And the running joke was that every time they went to a polling location, John Mulaney came out as like one of the poll workers. And he's like, oh, sorry, this polling location is closed. And so they were like, oh, I guess we'll go to the next one. And they'd stroll on to the next one. And they went to like 4 different locations before they finally got to one that was open. And they had to like walk through a highway across town to get to this location. And when they finally get there, they were stuck in line for hours, which is ridiculous. And then the punchline is that when they finally got to the beginning of the line or the end of the line, where they were able to enter, they didn't have their masks and couldn't go in. And so it brought it from like the 1970s into 2020. And you could definitely tell that there were black people in that writing room because I feel like it
That's
gave a really great picture of, especially in urban areas where there are a lot of people of color, usually, especially poorer people of color, their issues with voter suppression. So if you're closing polling locations and making people go to one location where they have to wait in line for hours and hours, that is not an incentive to vote at all. No one wants to stand in line to vote, especially when some people are just like, well, my vote doesn't matter anyway because of the electoral college. Or maybe they have to work and they don't get the day off because it's not a national holiday, which is another problem.
I actually have a quick story about that.
Yeah.
That happened recently for this election cycle. Um, so I live in a pretty white neighborhood. I can't vote, and I will go into that a little bit later. But my roommate was telling me that she went to go vote in person. She did early voting, but um, she went in. It was like a very, very quick process. Everything was like laid out pretty smoothly. Like probably took her like 15 minutes to get through and like do her voting and like get out. Like from like getting there to getting out was like 15 minutes.
Hmm.
Again, I live in a pretty white neighborhood. My best friend is from Chicago. She is from the south side of Chicago, where it's predominantly black. She was telling me that it was a long line. As soon as she got there, she actually tried to go 2 days. The first day she went, the line was so long that she just decided to go the next day because it was just ridiculous. Like she would have been standing there for in the cold for hours and hours. Um, and then when she came back, that even took forever to get through. And she was telling me that, um, like because it's COVID, everything has to be social distance. But
Mhm.
um, like getting into the building was such a process. Like it was a long line, and then there was only like one room with like one like voting booth or two voting booths for all these people outside, and that took her hours to actually just cast her vote and get out. So that's a very clear example for voting suppression for 2020.
And people try to make it seem like it's not voter suppression, but I'm like, yes, it is. Like, if you're forcing people to have to wait, it's voter suppression. Like, it should be quick and easy, whether it's early or on the actual day of the election. Don't I just call a spade a spade? Like, you want to suppress votes, and you're doing it by reducing the polling locations. Or another thing is they will not necessarily close it, but they'll change the building and make it less accessible for handicapped people or disabled people. And that's another episode that we can go into, the intersectionality of being a person of color and having a disability. But it's been a complaint that I've heard from a lot of people that it's not accessible because of having no ramp, or like a super steep ramp or things like that. It's ridiculous. The next subtopic under voter suppression is voter ID. And this is another thing that was on our timeline. So basically, voter ID laws didn't become a thing until 1950. And in the years since then, 14 states adopted laws requesting that people need an ID to vote. And so since 2000, 20 additional states have passed voter ID laws as well. And 10 states have revised or passed new laws requiring, but not requesting, an ID to vote. And again, not necessarily directly tied to race, but certain groups of people, due to poverty or their overall situation, may not have a voter ID, even if they are, or they may not have an ID, whether it be a license, a passport, or whatever. They just may not have that due to financial reasons. And again, just more ways to suppress people's right to vote.
Yeah, I wanna, like, give a quick example just because I think a lot of people don't understand, like, how difficult it is to get an ID,
Mhm,
especially if you're, like, in poverty. Um, so, like, for example, just take this as, like, an example. If somebody's homeless, they don't have an address, they don't have a permanent address that they can give.
mhm,
If you don't have a permanent address or, like, bills coming in, to a specific address, like you can't go to the DMV and try to get a license. Like that's like one of the first things that you need,
mhm,
right? Or get an ID. So that's a very concrete example of how it can be very difficult for somebody who is homeless or is living not in like permanent, not in a permanent like household,
mhm.
uh, to get an ID and then register to vote.
Another thing I've also noticed with people who aren't even necessarily homeless, but they're low income and they have to move apartments or where they're living a lot, you have to pay for a new license or ID
Mm.
technically every time so that your address matches what's on your ID. And those are not free. You have to
Yeah.
change like your car registration and things like that too. And so some people will just keep the same license and registration that they had before because they can't afford to buy a new one. They're like, well, this one hasn't expired, so I'm just going to keep that until it expires and I have to purchase a new one. And if your license says that, you have to go to the polling location that that license says if you live in a state that requires that. So that means maybe you are in a whole different part of the state or a different part of the town. You'd have to drive to wherever that polling location is to where your address is registered, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, that reminds me, there was like um an article a couple months back, or I don't even know, some time ago, that came out about this like old lady who was like in her 90s who traveled like 3,000 miles to go vote, and people were like, "Oh, that's so sweet. She's doing her civic duty." Like, no, it's not. That's voter suppression. Like she did not need to go 3,000 miles because that's where she was registered to vote, and that's, that's maybe that's her what her ID said.
I think I saw that one too, but it's ridiculous. And the last subtopic under voter suppression, and this was sort of what sparked me to be like, we need to do a voting and election episode because it was so ridiculous. And I'll link the tweet and the description once again. But someone posted a literacy test from Louisiana, and that was probably one of the first forms of voter suppression that is absolutely sinister. But at least it's so sad where you can say like at least they weren't like being killed. Like that's
Mhm.
that's sad that we
The bar
have
is
that
too low.
comparison. The bar is very low. But literacy tests were especially popular in the South, where there were lots of Black people. And the goal was to give them the literacy test to be even able to register to vote or to vote. And the expectation was that people should have at least a fifth grade level to be able to vote, and then they would have to prove that they had that fifth grade level. So this literacy test is 30 questions long, and they have 10 minutes to complete all the questions. And
Jesus.
the directions say, do what you are told to do in each statement, nothing more, nothing less. Be careful, as one wrong answer denotes failure of the test. You have 10 minutes to complete the test. And so in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm not expecting this to be super easy, but with like multiple degrees, I'm like, I should be able to at least answer some of the questions. But the issue is one, the language of it. I wouldn't say it's overall the most difficult language, like in terms of vocabulary. Like I'd understand these words individually, but it's how they phrased it. So,
So confusing.
so for example, the very first question is number one, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. And so when I read the question, I was like, how do you draw a line around something? Is that a circle? Like, are they trying to trick me? And the questions only get worse from there. So another example is question 15. It says, in the space below, write the word noise backwards and place a dot over what would be its second letter, should it have been written forward. And again, I know what those words mean individually. And in theory, it should not be that hard of a question, but it absolutely is very confusing.
Yeah. I would have probably spent 10 minutes like reading and rereading just that question.
And so the last part of the Twitter post basically explains that whoever was proctoring this exam had all of the power, and they basically got to decide who passed and who didn't. And so obviously, if that person was racist, no matter what that black person did, they were absolutely going to fail. So it could be something as simple as like a spelling error or a grammar error, or not following the directions properly, or not answering a question properly. And it was basically up to the proctor's discretion. So let's say I did draw a circle for question number one and I circled the letter, but they're like, that's not a line. You should have drawn a square or a rectangle. They could honestly make up anything they want to make that person fail, therefore, not allowing that person to vote. And it's really so sad because we already know that a lot of black people did not have any reading instruction, and just not even being able to know what the test is saying, let alone getting through this very difficult test. It's really sad. And although they're not doing that anymore, when I read my ballot for this year, I'm just like, for the people, it was pretty clear. Like you're voting for the president, you're voting for a governor or whatever. But when it comes to like laws or decisions, they're always so wordy and they're always just not clear. And I'm like, there has to be a better way for you to word this, even for English speakers. It's just not the most accessible, even just on the ballot itself.
It's just sad. That is
But yeah, so there's lots of other forms of voter suppression, but I wanted to highlight those. And the last part, we're just going to share our experience overall with voting and elections and our perspectives.
All right. Well, I'll start because I did kind of throw in there that I can't vote. So before somebody calls ICE on me, I just want to say I am a permanent resident. I am a green card holder. I am legally allowed to be here. I am lawfully around about. I'm lawfully allowed to be here.
Period.
Yes. Don't send ICE for me. Okay. I have my papers. Even then, just don't do that. Just don't call ICE on anybody because they're terrible people.
Minding your business is free.
Yes. Um, but because I am just a green card holder, because I'm just a permanent resident, I'm not a citizen yet. So, as I talked about earlier, citizenship is required to be able to vote. Um, and so it's like vote like elections and voting has always been like very frustrating for me because I have lived in this country for almost 20 years, like the majority of my life. Certainly all of my adult life, I have not left. Um, and so I wouldn't necessarily classify this as voter suppression, but it could be, I guess. It is very difficult to try to get your citizenship, even if you are a legal resident here. Not only like does it cost like my rent basically to pay to do the exam, and then whatever other steps are necessary afterwards. Um, like I also have to take a test, which I'm pretty sure most people who were just born citizens probably will fail.
Yep.
Um, and again, it costs like my rent. So I either pay my rent or I get to vote and work for the post office. That's basically the only thing I get.
And then your vote, depending on what state you live in, may not even really count because electoral college.
Right. So it's frustrating because I understand that for a lot of people, like it is like a lot of people have fought for the right to vote. Um, I work in policy, kind of, and so and I live um, outside of DC, just outside of DC. So policy and like it's just a part of my life, and to not be able to voice my opinion and express it through voting is a very frustrating thing for me to go through every single time. And so, I understand why some people don't want to vote because of one reason or another. I don't necessarily, I can't understand that. I'm sure they have their valid reasons, but um, as somebody who can't vote and who wants to vote, like really, I just feel sad, honestly, that I can't participate.
Yeah. And I've heard of people saying that they don't want to vote for X, Y, and Z reason as well. But I feel like if you are anyone that isn't a white man, like I just don't understand how you can ignore that you finally have the right to vote as a US citizen when, as we went through our timeline and we saw that even 100 years ago, not everyone was allowed to vote safely and allowed to vote without any barriers or any caveats and things like that. And even if we know maybe the election is rigged because of the electoral college or your vote doesn't matter, but at least in my house, voting was always just something that you do. It wasn't, my parents were always a good example. Like, I knew when election day was coming that they were going over to the local school, which is where our polling place was, and they were going to wait in line to vote. And I, like, I do know there are homes where people don't take it seriously, so their parents were not setting that example. But I just can't imagine like saying like, oh yeah, like my grandma couldn't vote. because she wasn't allowed to as a black woman. And now I'm choosing not to vote. Like it just, I could never convince myself of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I are, pretty much on the same boat for this. I think for some people, like, they really just don't trust the system. They don't like the system, whatever the reason is. I still don't. For me, that's not compelling enough not to vote.
Mhm.
Um, Again, they're entitled to their own opinion. If you could give your vote to me, like, that would be great, but that's not legal. So whatever.
Yeah, and so I've been old enough to vote since the 2016 election. That was my first one, and it just happened to be the year of a presidential election. And so I've voted in the three elections that I was allowed to vote for as far as presidential. I feel like an issue amongst a lot of people, like this is nationwide, people aren't voting in local elections as much as they should. And so that's one of my goals now that I'm like a real grown up and out of school, to start participating in local elections more and in primaries, because I think that is where we can start to see some grassroots change. But I always did an absentee ballot for the 2016 and 2000. No, wait. Oh, I messed up. I definitely was allowed to vote in 2012 election. You can keep this in. I'm
Okay.
not the best with years and math, people. So
I mean, it's also
2012.
2020, so
I'm like, again,
time is just like
we
whatever.
both thought 1970 was 30 years ago. So um, we'll call it quarantine brain. But
Yes.
so yes, so I voted absentee for the 2012 and the 2016 elections. And obviously this year I had an absentee ballot, but I made sure I delivered that directly to the polling location. So I'm like, here, like, I don't want it to go in the mail. Who knows what the post office is doing right now, if they're going to take forever. I delivered it right there. They gave me my receipt and my sticker, and I kept it moving. But definitely want to get involved on local elections more as well, just so I can say, like, oh, yeah, like I am actively trying to make a change in areas where my vote is more likely to count. Um, and I'm just hoping in the upcoming years that people are going to learn from this election and hopefully doing research about, like, wait, why do we have an electoral college, and why is there voter suppression? What is it? Because I feel like a lot of things in our country get done because so many people are ignorant. Not that they want to be, but they don't even know that they're ignorant, that they're missing out on something. And that's how the people who want bad things to happen thrive.
Like, I just want to add like a little point about like midterm elections too, and like local elections. I think so. We're talking about suppression. I don't, this is like one of those, like, I feel like gray areas, um, where there's not a lot of attention, um, in midterm elections compared to presidential elections. And I almost think that it is a little bit on purpose, because if we go back to elementary school, there's three branches of government, right? There's the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch. In the midterm elections, you're electing people who are, like, the focus is like on the legislative branch. So your senators, your representatives in the House, um, and they're the ones who write the laws. It's not the president. So actually, those elections are a little bit more important than just the presidential. Of course, in the presidential, like, elections in the year, there's people in the legislature who are up for re-election, or you could elect a new one. Um, but I think people need to start paying attention to the lawmakers and not just the president.
Absolutely. And I know we're sort of running low on time because we don't want to be on this podcast for as long as this election took, which felt like years. But um, I'm hoping that conversations like what we're having and having people listen in on it will inspire them to want to do more research, to get more involved in local elections, even run for office maybe when they're old enough or when they're able to. Conversations like these are so important because, like I was saying, it sort of gets rid of that ignorance and makes people realize, like, oh wait, that is awful, or they are suppressing my right to vote. And conversations like these are just very important.
Yeah. And then a last sort of message from me, especially to the people who voted for Biden. Um, just want to say, like, yes, it's awesome that we finally got rid of Trump. However, the work does not stop there. Don't just be like, whew, we're done. That was intense. We can go back to our regular lives. That is not the case. Okay? That's one election. So keep keep your keep staying informed, keep paying attention to politics, and do whatever else is necessary to make sure that your voice is heard and that your rights are being protected.
Yes. And one last thing from me. If Chris Cuomo ever gets wind of this podcast, please contact me. And I will leave it at that.
Yes. Yep. I second that. But Jocelyn has dibs, so
I thought of it first. That's
okay.
the way my brain works. One track. One track mind over here.
Yeah. Great coverage of the election. Let's just put it at that.
Top tier.
Hmm.
Lots of fan cams. Thank you, TikTok.
It's great. Anyway, so that is our podcast on the election. Um, it's racist. What else is there to say?
Shocking on this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that you listen to the next one as well.
All right, talk to you then.
Bye.